Hey everyone! In my last video I talked about dramatic storytelling and some of the core components we need for that. Assuming we have those, we can now start planning our exciting, dramatic game. Players, if you're not a GM looking to plan a game, you can still learn something from this video as well. The best thing about this style of planning is that it is absolutely spoiler-proof. The more people know about it, the better the story we all tell becomes in the end. Good planning is everything. If you plan a game well, you will never be caught by surprise, and your players can still pull moves that you would have never thought of. We can do this with a little conjuring trick, some dark GMing magic that, when well performed, allows us to both give players the absolute freedom they need to play their characters well, and the ability to react to anything they could possibly do, no matter how wild their stunts. For this to work, we need 3 steps. Setup. The before times. Before we can even get started putting a pen to paper or a Word document to life, we need some basic components. There's the obvious ones, the ones that usually break campaigns before they even start. You need players, you need a set and regular schedule, you need some space both mentally and physically. Dramatic storytelling doesn't work if you're violently reminded that your baby can and will puke on you any chance it gets. And the baby doesn't care how dramatic and tense the scene is, so do yourself a favour and find a safe space to hide, at least for one gaming session. Once that's all dealt with, we can sit down at our desk, grab our drink, and stare at the dreaded, the horrid, the undefeated blank page. Nothing comes to mind. You've had the experience before, and it sucks. So, let's give it a little structure. If you're the type of person who feels constrained by structure, I still urge you to give it a shot. If nothing comes to mind, limiting your options just a little bit can result in some unexpected ideas. You can always look at the ideas and dismiss them if you don't like what you come up with. But let's start. Before you jump into the planning process, write down, or type down, whichever one you want, 3 words: tone, theme, and thesis. We're going to use these 3 to guide us through the creative process. You can tackle these in any order, but I like to start with tone. I talked about tone a bit in my previous video, but to summarize, tone is the mood you want to set for the table and the story. Tone can include genre, but isn't limited to it. For example, there's fantasy by way of Tolkien, and then there's fantasy by way of George R. R. Martin. While both are fantasy, the tone is decidedly different. One way I recommend thinking about tone is, what's the general vibe? Game of Thrones has this dark, semi-realistic vibe where everyone can die at any time, while Lord of the Rings is an epic fantasy piece about the world as much as the characters and their heroic deeds. If a GM wants their players to understand the tone, it can be very helpful to give some examples of popular media you all know to narrow it down. That doesn't mean you're copying, it just means that there is a similar style that does what you want to do as well. If the tone is how you talk about your story, then your theme is what you actually talk about. Theme is the central thing your story is concerned with. That can be something as abstract and philosophical as power, monotheism, or morality, but it can also be way more specific. For example, your theme could be magic items or resource management. You can pick anything, but I recommend checking if the tone you picked is a good fit for the theme. If your theme is war crimes and the tone you picked is light-hearted Bugs Bunny-esque, then you might want to reconsider. Your thesis is where you refine your tone and theme into something you want to say. Sure, you can make a general story about power, but that will lack specificity. A general story about power is too broad, the subject way too far-reaching to ever say anything meaningful about it. That's where your thesis kicks in. The thesis is what you want to say about the theme you have chosen. The more specific your thesis is, the better your story. You and your players can focus on one specific story that becomes more and more fleshed out the longer you go on, instead of having to generally waffle about for the whole game. I've not explained how tone, theme, and thesis work, but without specific examples it's going to be a little bit hard to really get what I'm about. And because this is a how-to, we can't neglect the practical section. I'm going to be planning a short campaign so you can see how I use this method and replicate it yourself. Turns out if you don't have one at home, store-bought isn't fine. Here's how we make one. Let's talk about tone first. I'm a big fan of Vampire the Masquerade, the roleplay game, especially the political elements of it. So let's yoink the idea of factions and politics from Vampire the Masquerade, Camarilla for those familiar. That alone isn't enough, so let's scour some more. I really like the Magnus archives, especially the character dynamics and the whole found family workplace vibe it's got going on. So let's yoink that as well. Lastly, so I can have a visual reference on screen, let's go with the whole nuanced evil but also honest-to-God monster thing that the animated Netflix Castlevania series has. So, for our tone, we have a character-driven campaign involving nuanced villains fought out mostly on a battlefield of politics and closeness. So far, so good. For good measure, let's give the whole thing a genre, though you don't need to do that. I think it's helpful to clarify the vibe a little further though. So let's say epic fantasy, just for argument's sake. For this campaign, I'm choosing the theme of melancholy. I want to talk about how past experiences influence and affect us, perhaps even in bad ways. The other day, I replayed one of my childhood favourite games, Heroes of Might and Magic 5, only to find out it really hasn't held up. In my memory, it was this fantastic epic fantasy story, but in reality, I found out it was a hacked-together bare-bones story about the good guys fighting the bad guys. In this way, memory makes fools out of all of us, and I find that interesting. I find a thesis is most useful or powerful when there's an action or an imperative involved. So we're looking for some statement about melancholy that, for the lack of a better phrase, makes you do something. So just saying melancholy makes a fool of us is a thesis, but not a very good one. That's not an enjoyable thing to play a story about, I think. So instead, let's go for something a bit more powerful. To live in the past is to doom the future. That way we get a snappy saying, a thesis centered around melancholy being bad, generally speaking, and something we can use literally for the campaign itself if we want. If you have these three things, thesis, tone, and theme, you're ready to go into the actual planning stage of the whole shebang. Our example campaign currently consists of an epic fantasy character-driven thing with nuanced villains in a politically close environment. This campaign's main point is that you have to let go of the past to live in the future. That sounds pretty complicated, doesn't it? How do we square the circle? How do we make it easy? Let me show you with step 2. The 5-act structure. Now, before we get to the actual beginning, I need to address the matter of player agency. While I don't believe that having a plot structure railroads the players in a bad way, I have experienced GMs who've plotted their campaigns and then started panicking when the players didn't do the thing they thought they would do. This leads to hurried corrections, the illusion of choice, and a whole bunch of other unpleasantries. So it's important to talk about how to avoid this kind of situation before it happens. The number one mistake that leads to this problem is specific planning. While you're planning a campaign, in these first steps, you don't know anything about the player characters. You don't know what their conflicts are, you don't know what they want, or even what their mechanical abilities are. So when you plan, don't make the entire structure dependent on one choice. By hinging the campaign climax and resolution on, say, the players fighting the villain, or siding with the centaurs, or any one decision, you basically create a failure condition for the campaign if that doesn't happen. The initial plans for a campaign need to be vaguer than the players kill the villain. Initially, you can only ever go so far as saying the players confront the villain, and that's just because you control the villain, and their desire clashes automatically with any hypothetical player character. If we can't even account for something like the big bad villain being killed by our player characters, how can we plan anything at all? That's where we need to walk the tightrope of balance. We need to lock down just enough elements in our setting, in our campaign premise, to have something to work with. This happens during the planning process. If there's something that you want in the campaign, then you have to lock that down. Ideally, the campaign premises, the thing you give the players when you first pitch it, will include most things that you've locked down. Everything else can be changed, or is something that players can influence that you've planned for. This sounds a bit esoteric at first, but it'll make more sense once we get to the planning setting of our hypothetical campaign. What is the 5-act structure? Theatre strikes back again. This is the conjuring trick, the dark magic I spoke of in the beginning. Don't worry, The 5-act structure is here to help us. There are a few different ways of structuring a story, but in my experience the 5-act structure is the easiest way to do it for a TTRPG campaign. The simple progression of setup, climax, and resolution is well suited to an improv game like D&D, because you can keep it simple. That way the story you tell can be exciting and tension-filled, while player choices still matter. What is the 5-act structure? There's a whole bunch of videos out there that can explain historical contexts, variations, etc., but here's the way I use it. The game is segmented loosely in 5 acts: setup, build-up, climax, denouement, and resolution. Act 1 introduces what's at stake, Act 2 sees the players build up to the most dramatic point, Act 3 is the dramatic point of no return, the epiphany upon which the entire story hinges. Act 4 then slowly winds things down without losing all the tension, giving one last problem to contend with, while Act 5 is your epilogue. Because this is a TTRPG, you don't actually want Act 5 to last long, because having players sit at the table listening to how it all turned out can be a bit boring. If you do want an epilogue session, or even a couple of epilogue sessions, find some way to involve the players beyond just describe what your character's doing now, after all is done. Interestingly enough, I don't think the first act is where you want to start planning. When I think about a story, a movie, a book, or even a TTRPG campaign I've experienced, I don't think about how it all started. At least not at first. No, I think about the most exciting, the pivotal moment during the campaign. In my opinion, that's the most important part, so logically that should be the part you plan first. Act 3. The most pivotal moment of a campaign, the make or break moment of any 5-act story, is the 3rd act. That's when the tension is highest and the stakes biggest. Here's the point where the players can fulfill their victory condition or fail, or something in between. To identify what your pivotal moments, sometimes called an epiphany, looks like, you have to go back to your thesis. Our thesis is, to live in the past is to doom the future. So, logically speaking, our most impactful moment must be designed around some decision the PCs make that either involves them deciding to live in the past, metaphorically speaking, or move on with their lives. Because we're planning for D&D, I would also recommend the 3rd act epiphany to involve some form of fight, but it doesn't have to. Just keep in mind that the mechanics should always aid storytelling, so keep your most climactic and exciting mechanics for this part of the story. Now you know, in theory, if vaguely, what your most important moment will be, so you need to plan backwards from here. If the 3rd act involves the players living in the past or moving into the future, you need setup in Act 1 that can support that kind of decision. For our example campaign, I'm going with a more literal interpretation of our thesis. There is a time mage who wishes to reset the world into a loop. As a little tangent, always check that your antagonistic forces make sense. If you create a story where there's one obviously good side and one obviously bad side, it might not fit the tone you're setting, and it definitely doesn't fit our politics nuanced evil thing, so we have to find out why somebody would want to put the world in a loop. Let's say the time mage wishes to preserve the, well, world is a little bit big, so let's make it personal actually. The time mage wishes to preserve the town the players live in a loop, to save it from an impending disaster that they have seen. Nobody but the time mage would be aware of this, so everybody could live out forever, happily repeating the same week or so. The PCs now face the important, nuanced moral decision. Do you stop the time mage, who believes it is better to decide for everyone that they best not face tragedy, or do you side with them to preserve the town? Now, we do have a thesis that blatantly tells us what the right decision is. This is the point where the sandbox falls away and theatre becomes more prominent. You need to set things up in a way that players can see what the correct and most dramatically rewarding decision in the context of the story is. Sure, you could make this an interesting moral struggle that doesn't have one mostly right answer, but that's not our thesis. That's a different story altogether, one that you can tell if that's your thesis. Our Act 3, then, is the decision to stop the time loop or preserve it. Our player characters need to have, by that point, all the necessary information to make that decision. In addition, they need to have picked up on the hints that the time mage isn't siding with the point of the story, ergo there is something imperfect and wrong with their live in the past forever plan. These hints have to kick off the story in Act 1, in what's usually referred to as the inciting incident. Something about the PC status quo is disrupted in a way that's so noticeable they must decide whether or not to do something about it. The answer, because they're PCs and we kind of need a game, has to be yes. This one is pretty easy. You ever get that feeling of deja vu? The PCs notice that they've been looping. They don't know how or why, but something about this loop is different. Ideally, you can let them know via their own memories that the time loop resets after 1 week. That way, you put a clock on the action, making everything much more tense. We've had the inciting incident, now you need to create the question. Should they do something about it? During long rests or opportune moments, hint at some impending disaster that happens at the end of the 7th day. Something that is only just prevented by the time loop kicking off. Let's say a nearby volcano erupts. That way there's no way that your PCs get sidetracked trying to prepare to fight a volcano, like they might a dragon or some other threat. A volcanic eruption is a force of nature, a catastrophe so great that our players, even at level 20, would struggle to fight it. They might succeed via wish and other cheats, but reasonably speaking, even a level 20 party would struggle to fight a volcanic eruption. So, on one hand the loop prevents us from being wiped out by the magma, on the other we need some conflict, something that ultimately says, no, this isn't the way to do it. The PCs notice that the week that's being looped isn't a good one for most people. The butcher has a horrible accident, the alchemist has run out of ingredients to help the sick and the injured, someone goes through a horrible breakup again and again. The cure to the volcanic eruption is a sickness in itself. Act 2. At this point, we're at the start of Act 2. The players need to know more about the loop, who caused it and why. They've seen some of the effects, but they don't know anything about it, apart from its powerful magic that even a 9th level spell couldn't mimic. And nobody in town is a high level archmage just chilling in the local village. Briefly, our campaign becomes an investigation. This is where the players notice just how much the village maybe isn't something that should be preserved. The mayor is corrupt and complacent in tradition and politics. They are barred from properly investigating at every corner by a minor antagonist in Act 1 and 2. Don't worry about them, we'll visit them later. Even with all their physical power as D&D PCs, they've caught in this net of relationships and rules because they, of course, live in this town as well. They might have families, loved ones, friends. They know the 3 guards in town since their childhood, so cutting them down because they're in the way becomes a monstrous act that you wouldn't consider. This is, by the way, why railroading is good, actually. Because we've talked about the tone and the kind of game we want to have, I can confidently say that none of the characters would just randomly kill a guard they've known since they were children. Were this a sandbox game, with characters who are little more than self-inserts, I couldn't comfortably predict that. Anyways, during their investigations, the players do actually find out who's responsible for the loop. The local orphanage is home to our villain, in quotation marks. A caretaker who can't bear the idea of their charges being consumed by the volcano. So they make a sacrifice, in exchange for the fear of the children, as the village is destroyed on the 7th day. A powerful devil made the time loop. This fear is a scrumptious meal for the devil, who thrives on such strong emotions, and this deal ensures a steady, pure supply each week. But it also technically saves the children. The players should talk to the villain, try to reason with them or understand their motives, but ultimately the villain is unswayable, convinced that their method alone is good and right. The players hit a brick wall, which they should, because even killing me doesn't change anything. The loop continues and I'll be back next week to make sure you never wake up to the reality of the loop again. A bit dramatic perhaps, but Now they can do the D&D thing, where they search for a plot device that allows the villain's weakness to be exposed. A loophole in the contract, which the villain stores in the bank. A deal with the devil themselves. A powerful artifact, a god promising aid at a pivotal moment. It doesn't matter. Again, we'll get back to that. Once they've acquired the possibility of victory, they enter. Act 3. Oh, wait, we've already planned Act 3. What a coincidence. Only now, it's much clearer. The players use the plot device from Act 2 to make that final decision. Break the loop, which will be resisted by the villain who bargained for more power or something, or preserve the loop. Now, one of these decisions is pretty boring. Preserving the loop means nothing happens. The story just kinda stops. I personally like that, because it's the point that living in the past will halt advancement. In addition, I doubt any player character would be happy with just giving up. That's not how the game works, and that's not how the hints that you've hidden in Act 2 say this should go. But if you want to, you can design opposition for either decision in Act 3, not just for this campaign, but for any campaign you plan. In this case, the opposition to not breaking the loop is boredom, which can be very powerful, it just probably isn't a good idea. So if you find yourself in this position, you could have a person wake them from the loop instead of their own memories. That way someone wants to break the loop, and you have a mentor-type NPC tucked away to oppose them if they choose not to do that. Act 4. Act 4 is the moment when the monster comes back for one final desperate attempt. The villain, whose defeat seemed so certain, makes one last gamble. You've seen this a million times before, in a million different skins and a million different movies. In this case, it's not even our villain who makes the final gamble. No, that's the volcano. Because remember, ideally the players broke the loop. So now the consequences of their actions loom on the horizon as the week resets one last time. It's the first day, and on the 7th, everything dies. The players now have to cut through the red tape and rules, the traditions that hindered their investigation, to evacuate the village. If the villain isn't dead, that would be ideal. Now they can defeatedly attempt to help the players as best they can, confirming our thesis if the village really can be saved. Living in the past wasn't the way to save the village. Actually saving it was, if the players manage, of course. But even if they don't, they knew this might happen. They choose to live in a world where consequences matter and the past stays in the past. There is power in that story. Act 5. Act 5 is the shortest one. Here's your epilogue. Your how are they doing now that everything is over? I recommend not making it that longer than 1 or 2 sessions, because while it may be interesting to some, there's nothing happening, no stakes, all the action has literally already been resolved. But it is important to feel like your actions have consequences that aren't immediate, so make sure that the world checks in with the players, so to speak. In our example, this might be the new village that saved villagers have built in the past few weeks since the eruption. The player's relationship with the town, how has it changed since they saved it, that kind of thing. That's our 5 acts, that's pretty good, right? What do you mean that's super vague? What do you mean character arcs? Oh god, there's more! Step 3. Player characters. So far, this game is pretty centered on the story you, the GM, want to tell. But isn't this a collaborative game? Sure, the players make some choices and drive the plot forward. They even have the choice to just stop the game. But they're just driving on this railroad that you built. It's a little more than an interactive, shitty movie. The reason why it feels that way is that what happens doesn't really matter. In my first video, I spoke of involvement, investment, and memorability. We may have a story template, but it won't come to life without player characters and their character arcs. I'm going to be talking about characters, conflicts, and arcs more extensively in the future, but for now, only this. Every character needs to have their own story to tell. Ideally, it should relate to what's going on with the main plot, like a viewpoint they're conflicted about, expressed through the main plot. But you can't make that decision. That's up to your players. One of the main points of Act 2 and 4, which so far seem a little bit underpopulated compared to the fattened pigs of Act 1 and 3, is to give character arcs place. Sure, you can influence that by talking to the players about the tone, but mostly they'll do their own thing. That's where our vagueness comes in. We've left some elements, like the minor antagonist from 1 and 2, or the big plot device, purposefully vague. That's what I meant when I spoke of locking down details. We've got a village, an orphanage, a devil, a time loop. But beyond that, the players can provide us. You can either directly ask them to create an antagonist, which is super fun and I recommend doing it at least once, or have a minor backstory character turn out way more important than they thought. Your main tool, besides talking to the players, is the introduction to your setting. Your players know the tone from our first step. Now you have to give them something. The setting, the introduction. This is where you really lock down those details I spoke of. Anything you want and need in your plan needs to be here. Anything else is up to the player characters and their backstories. Erenacht is a small village in the outskirts of the Smoking Mountains in Kingdom. It is home to many a happy people, with a tight-knit community that sustains itself via fishing, foraging, mining, and forestry. Despite its relatively isolated nature, Erenacht enjoys popularity in the common conception of kingdom because of its heroes. This group of adventurers recently thwarted the plot of a young green dragon who tried to throw the nation into chaos. Now, these heroes have returned to take a well-deserved rest amongst their loved ones. Not all is as it seems, though, as the idyllic village eventually turns out to have a far stranger undertone. There you go. Now you've done it. All you need to do is wait until your players come to you with fully fleshed out characters, and again I will do a video on that in the near-ish future. But for now, you have a fully functional, if vague, plan on how the rough plot is going to go. The closer your campaign's start date gets, the more fleshed out these details will become. Once your players have come up with their characters, feel free to fill in the gaps that we've left, like the antagonist or the plot device. Using your players' characters for that, again, is well advised and makes them feel like important parts of the story. In the same way that you do that, you can fill in the gaps and vagaries when you need them, instead of worrying about getting to this highly specific place or NPC they absolutely have to get to. Lastly, once you've locked down something, don't change it. Don't be afraid of players calling the plot or watching this video, because it is our goal to tell the compelling story together. Even knowing these details beforehand only enables players to facilitate the rails you're laying down. That's it for now. How to plan a specific session, how to run a session, and what I consider to be a fully fleshed out character is going to be the subject of future videos. I hope you could get something from this. Goodbye everyone, and happy storytelling.